Well, thank you for downloading our podcast. Daniel is a book that is given to us in a time when Judah's history is less than stellar. They are carried off into a foreign land. They have turned from our God, and now the Lord hands them over to the nation of Babylon. Is the Lord sovereign enough and strong enough to preserve his people? Is the Lord able to overpower this mighty world ruler, Nebuchadnezzar? Is Nebuchadnezzar the king who is able to do what his predecessors could not? Build a prestigious tower, so great and so strong that he could penetrate the very fortress of heaven? If you're curious about these questions, please stay tuned as we work through the book of Daniel.
Well, as we go on in the study of Daniel, we find that the great Nebuchadnezzar has died. Nebuchadnezzar, the great king that even Daniel commemorates, is a king who kills and he makes alive. The king who determines who's exalted and who will be humbled. The king, as we've seen and summarized, who very much sees himself as a god, or at least a godlike being. However, the Lord is the one who humbles him. And so this great Nebuchadnezzar, we have no report of his funeral. We have no report of his death. We just simply move on in the narrative, again reminding us of the subtlety of the Lord being the sovereign ruler. It's not about the kings of this age. It's not about the people of this world. It's about the God who rules over this creation. And so in terms of this narrative and this story, we find a feast that's being held. Now, this is not a New Year's feast. It seems that it's some feast most likely to rejuvenate morale in the kingdom. Obviously, as they're facing war, this seems to be Belshazzar trying to show that he is one who's bringing the people together. So again, feasts in Scripture can either be good or bad. We think of the heavenly banquet table, or being at the Lord's table and thinking of a heavenly feast. That's an example of something good. We're in the presence of God is a picture. We're dining at his table. We're being fed on true life by our Lord. In terms of the banquets of this age, they can be bad. These banquets can be a fellowshipping of man joining together in their rebellion against God, like Babylon being the gateway to the gods, this place that would bring God down and lead him around on a leash, which is at least their thinking. Obviously, they found that's not the case at all. And we can also think of another example of a banquet with Job and his children, not necessarily sinful. So in terms of what's going on here, we're going to first sort of ask, what is this banquet that's going on? What's the purpose? And when we find this new king that has risen to power, is the Lord really sovereign enough to put down this rebellion in the midst of this great banquet? Is the Lord really able to show his mighty hand? And what does that fundamentally mean? And so we'll simply divide this into the writing of the wall and the reading or the discerning of the wall. So just basically put it in those two big, broad scenes that goes on here. So we begin by looking at seeing the wall, or the writing on the wall, in verses 1 through 9. We begin then with this king who now gathers together, we find a feast of 1,000. So this is not a small feast by any means. We find that it's the concubines, it's his wives, it's the rulers or the lords of the kingdom. So this 1,000 is really seeing sort of this international gathering together and celebrating the goodness of Babylon. So it could be in a sense of just a thanksgiving for what this empire means. It could be something else. We really don't know at this point. We just know that there's 1,000 people gathered together and they're having this feast. Now, as we have already thought about Nebuchadnezzar and how he valued himself, and we find this king Belshazzar, we don't know a lot about him. We do know that Nebuchadnezzar was his grandfather, technically. And so this Belshazzar is the son of another king who married into Nebuchadnezzar's family, Nabonidus, hopefully I said that correctly, Nabonidus, who actually at this time is exiled over to Egypt, or to Arabia. And as he's exiled, it's because he's had some issues with the priests. At least that's the tradition that's been handed down. So it's important to understand when we hear of King Belshazzar and how he promotes himself as a son of Nebuchadnezzar. You're sensing this man is very conscious of where he is in terms of the kingdom. He's not a direct heir. He's only here as a co-regent, or a co-king, if you will. It's only as long as his dad is in Arabia that this king rules. So it's important to understand this king is trying to prop himself up. He is a king who is aware of his inferior position. His dad is only a son-in-law, not a direct son. So you can understand when the queen even addresses him and says, "Your father," that they understand. If you call attention to his position, he still most likely has the authority to execute you. So this is not a guy you want to upset. And so you can understand this is why people are not calling attention to this potential problem of his reign. Now again, some people, I call this to your attention, people who are familiar with the text will say, see, there's an error in Daniel's reading. Daniel's not reading history properly. I say, well, actually he is reading history properly. They understand. Right now, this guy's atop. When this guy says, feed him to the lions, put him in the pit, execute him, his word has that much authority. So you do not want to upset him. So you're not going to turn to this guy and say, hey, co-regent, or hey, co-king, or hey, one who's merely sort of a son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, sort of tied through that line. You don't do that. So it's important to understand this king knows his vulnerable place. This is where he is. So this banquet, when we have this banquet, they're drinking wine, there's 1,000 gathered together. This is this king propping himself up. Look how great I am. Look how wonderful I am. Look at what I have done. Look at my kingdom. But you find the hints that this king is aware of his position. Daniel, sort of in a smart way, communicates. So he tastes the wine. So again, this is the boasting of what their kingdom has produced. Look at this fine wine. Well, what does he do? He calls for the gold and silver vessels. But it's not the gold and silver vessels that merely come from Jerusalem, or the gold and silver vessels from the temple of Jerusalem. It's the gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple. And so right there's a subtlety, see? He's riding the coattails of another. He hasn't accomplished anything, which is true for his kingship. Nebuchadnezzar, a tyrant, a man that we've seen, a rather fearful, frightening individual, is a man who actually did accomplish something. So whatever you want to say about him, he actually got stuff done and brought this empire together. So this man is basically on the coattails of Nebuchadnezzar. So as he brings these vessels of gold and silver from Jerusalem, he's the one who celebrates and has this wine. Now, as he has this wine in the gold and silver vessels, there's something going on in this narrative. That he is celebrating how their gods are superior to the God of Israel. So you're seeing something else about this man that's coming out in his inferiority. He didn't conquer these. His gods didn't conquer these. Even Nebuchadnezzar is the one who has conquered the temple. He has conquered Jerusalem, and he's brought these vessels over. This man is only going on the accomplishments of another. But what does he do? You can see, like his dad, where he got in trouble of trying to introduce other deities. What's he doing? Well, he's engaging in idolatry. That they drink the wine, they praise the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now, there's a few things going on here. The first thing is this is the language simply of what we can find in the Psalms or Isaiah or Jeremiah, where it talks about the fallacy of the gods of this age, right? It's the gods of man trying to set up his own poles, his own worship centers, defining his own gods, coming up with his own religion, because again, the Lord continues to press upon us. We're conscious there's a God, and we don't naturally want to bow our knee to the true living God. So man comes up with his own religion. So there's that reality. But there's something else if you hear the elements that are used here. Does this sound like anything we've heard in the narrative? Well, this is like the vision of Nebuchadnezzar, isn't it? Where he finds himself before that great statue that's overwhelming, and that's gold, silver, bronze, made of stone. It's something that's fragile, has clay. It's not something that's strong. And so this isn't about finding which particular deities are they worshiping, how many deities are they worshiping. It's more calling attention to the problem of Babylon. Remember this city, remember this empire, an international people. Babel is a place where we're going to build a tower that's so great, we're going to pierce the fortress of heaven. We're going to bring God down. We're going to lead him around on a leash. Well, the same mindset is being celebrated in Belshazzar. Bel, protect the king. Again, calling attention to that reality is saying, here I am, the one protected by Bel, the one who's going to rise. Look at what this great empire has done. Let us celebrate the goodness of our God. So again, this recalls for us what we have seen with Nebuchadnezzar, the one who kills and makes alive, a godlike identity in Deuteronomy 32. The Lord himself ascribes this to himself. And it's also important to remember as we go forward in this, and we look at just these few verses at this point, that all mankind is in covenant with God. And when we say that, I'll let you process that for a moment. I'm not saying all mankind is redeemed in Christ. I'm saying all mankind is in covenant with God. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that all mankind is in covenant with God in terms of a broken covenant of works. So in terms of that reality, all of us are waiting that final day of prosecution, final day of judgment, when the Lord brings that punishment of the covenant of works. Now, those who are in Christ are those who are in the covenant of grace that we find in Genesis 15 and 17. So in terms of this king being here, we can say, well, why does he owe allegiance to God? Well, on one hand, he's under a covenant of works, and he needs to recognize who the true God of heaven is. What is more, we think of the covenant of common grace that we've talked about in Genesis 8, that this king is to rule over the empire, not just for his own boasting, not just for his own pride, not just for his own significance. And so here's the irony. This king has no significance in and of himself, but yet as he rides on the coattails of his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, he's the one who now celebrates the conquering of the Israelite God by drinking from these vessels of gold and silver, celebrating the goodness of the kingdom, mocking what the Lord has revealed, that this kingdom is not going to stand, but yet he's not embracing that. So now we find in the midst of this celebration, this joy that's going on, if you will, that there's this dismembered hand. Now, this is something that's pretty freaky, because keep in mind who's all here. Concubines, basically those who are obviously part of the royal harem, his wives, his lords, which would be those who are directly under his authority, like the little governors that would answer to him. These are all assembled together. This king has to put on his power face. He has to show that he's in control. He has to show that he's significant. So here he is celebrating. All of a sudden, there's this hand that appears and starts writing on the wall. Now, exactly what's going on, how this happens, whether they all saw the hand, we don't really know. Whatever the case, it would be rather comical if the others didn't see the hand, because then they're going to think, well, do we tell the king maybe he's a little crazy here or what? But whatever the case, it's pretty likely that they at least see the writing on the wall, whether they see the hand or not. And so as they gather together and they see the writing on the wall, you would think that they would have some sense of what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, Remember, this is a king who boasted of his pride, the king who put out that challenge that anyone who was going to give him the interpretation had to tell him the dream and then the interpretation. And so this is intended to have that echo back to it in terms of its not going into all the details as to whether everyone saw the hand and if everyone sees the actual process of the writing. The implication is the wise men do see the writing on the wall. Now, as this takes place, we find that the king's countenance changes. He moves from one who most likely looks very healthy, has color in his face, one who appears very strong, which is the intention of this banquet. He wants to give the presentation that here I am as the heir of Nebuchadnezzar. I'm competent to go forward. Even though my dad's in exile, I'm still one who's in control and able to do this. Well, he falls apart. And he falls to a place where his face and his healthy color moves to the point where he's white as a ghost. His knees start to knock. He gets weak. And so this is not the presentation he wants to give. This is not the orb, the vibe that he intends for this banquet to have. But nevertheless, this is where he is. Now this becomes rather comical, because the language here is language that's most likely Aramaic. Think about Babel. Think about Babylon. What was the great accomplishment Babel was going to do? Well, the great accomplishment was it was going to unify the world. And as it brought the world, people would come from far away to come to this tower and to see the God that they've harnessed. Right? That was the goal. What did the Lord do? Well, he confused their languages, so they couldn't finish this building project, which is rather comical. The Lord, sort of how it's presented in terms of anthropomorphic language. Again, remember that's using language of man, applying it to God. God has to sort of lean forward. I'm not saying this is how God really works. But the presentation is that these men boasted their great endeavor, but it's so small that God still needs to look down and squint to see what this great accomplishment is. And all the Lord does is make a decree, man's language is confused, and the building project ceases. Now we fast forward to the actual empire of Babylon. And as we have these lords who are assembled from the different groups, different nationalities who are brought together. Remember, we talked about how this is sort of like that satanic city where Nebuchadnezzar has done what God promised to do with Abraham. This city has done. So it's an international city. It has brought together the multicultures and the languages, everything that a successful empire is to do. There's simple writing on the wall. No one can read the writing on the wall. It's intended to poke fun of them. Oh, you're going to challenge me, is basically what the Lord's saying. How about you just read this little message and figure it out? Well, the king, in all his terror, his bravado leaves him. And now, like Nebuchadnezzar, he calls in the wise men. Calls in the Chaldeans, calls in the astrologers, calls in the magicians, everyone who can read this. Well, you can read the writing on the wall, and keep in mind, these are letters that would not be divided. It would just be one line put together. So you have to try and figure out where to break up the words. Then you have to figure out what the words mean, where it's talking about minas and shekels and weights, and you're saying, I don't know what this means. I mean, it's talking about monetary trading or something, right? I mean, that's what it sounds like when you read this. Well, none of these men can read it. They don't know what to do. And so this man, engaged in his idolatrous feast, celebrating the significance of the kingdom with the echo back to that statue that was great and majestic, is now one who is once again helpless. His multicultural community, his language, all the language barriers that have been taken away at Babel, that have been overcome in this great empire, cannot read the writing on the wall. Furthermore, this is significant, because in Babylon, when there was a decree that was made, it was written down because it was seen as being permanent. So when there's a dismembered hand writing something on the wall, it's making a decree that is permanent. And so he understands the message that's being sent here. There is something permanent from some being who's greater than him, greater than his empire, and he's got to figure out what this means. So he's helpless. And as he's helpless, we find with this result that now he calls in his most likely his mother. And I say that because you have his wives, you have the concubines who are here, which implies that these are the wives, maybe one of them would be the queen. Now the actual queen is telling us something else about his position. If he has to call her in, it means she's not here as a wife, right? Because they have to send for her. So as she hears of this, she comes into the room, and it seems that some of the officials have gone out. She's heard the chatter, so now she enters the scene. So this tells us with the identity of her as queen, this is either his mother or his grandmother, one who is tied to Nebuchadnezzar. This could be Nebuchadnezzar's wife or one of his wives. We don't know the specifics. We just know she's identified as the queen, which tells us that this king, who claims to be the king, is not really the king. He still has to listen to a woman, the queen. Now, in the ancient Near East, that's a pretty humbling thing. That's the reality of what's going on here. She enters. She tells him what's going on. She says, listen, I remember Nebuchadnezzar, most likely my husband. When she talks about Nebuchadnezzar and what has happened, she says there was this man who had the spirit of the gods. Now notice that again, that language is the spirit of the gods. So this is an identity and understanding that there are the gods that are somewhere, and as the gods rule and as the gods make decrees, there's a man who can tap into that. We got him here in the kingdom. This guy's amazing. He can solve problems. He can solve riddles. You want to call for him, which tells us how clueless this king really is in the operations of this empire. He should know about Daniel. He should know that this man's significant. We also find that the Chaldeans and the others, they're still sort of worried about their position because they're not talking about Daniel. So we're seeing that in this scenario, this king boasting of his great place, he's not really that great. So he ends up calling in Daniel. And we find that as Daniel is here, he's had this resume presented, then he's brought in before the king. Now as Daniel's brought in before the king, he's one who interacts with the king, and he's one of the exiles, and as Belshazzar meets with him, he doesn't address him as Belshazzar. We don't really know exactly why. Most likely it's because his name is too close to Belshazzar. As we're setting the scene, we're understanding he's not going to want someone else who might be confused as a king. So it seems this is part of his insecurity. Ironically, he's going by Daniel's Hebrew name. This means God is my judge. So Daniel is living up to his name. He doesn't care about the king. He cares about his Lord. His Lord is not the king. His Lord is the God over Israel, our God, the God we serve today. So notice how Belshazzar is so disconnected from the community. He is one that as Daniel's brought in before him, was to say, oh, I've heard of you. Yeah, you just heard of him a few moments ago from your grandmother, most likely, or your mom. That's how you heard of him. So we find this guy really doesn't have a handle on the empire. But he wants to sound like he's put together. But he also wants to show Daniel may at best just be sort of a sideshow. And he says, as I've heard of you, I hear that the gods are with you. And as the gods are with you, you can sort of solve stuff. And, you're kind of important and you've done some interesting things. So you can hear in his tone this devaluing of Daniel. He's really not that significant. He's one that maybe the gods might work with him, but he's not that important. He calls Daniel's attention, what has happened, the wise men, the enchanters, they've come. There's this writing on the wall here. They've looked at it. They don't know what it means. Kind of heard that you can solve problems, so, would you give us a few moments? I mean, it's absolutely disrespectful. There is no honor of what Daniel has done, no honor of what Daniel has seen or witnessed. Now, Daniel's most likely about 75, 80 years old at this time. So you can understand being an old man or older or advanced or grown in wisdom, I think is a better way of saying it. As he's grown in wisdom, we'll put it that way, he's one whose attention you find is cut short. And so you kind of sense him as being one who's standing here, not really all that worried about what the king thinks of him. And as Daniel interacts with this king, notice the reward that the king gives. The king basically says, I'm going to bless you with riches, I'll make you third in the kingdom, I'll give you a purple robe, you'll have a necklace. In other words, you have the promise of royalty. Now Daniel himself is already over the wise men. So in terms of this, Daniel doesn't care. What is more, this sort of also recalls for us a story in Israel's history from Numbers 22 through 24. We have Balaam and Balak. We have Balaam, the great prophet, who's going to speak these words against the people of Israel, and his words come to pass, and he can manipulate the gods. Turns out there's one God who truly is supreme and sovereign over all, and this doesn't end well for Balaam. And so Daniel, in denying this, is again recalling the event of that, whereas Balaam basically, the Lord breaks his knees, if you will, to make him bow before him. We have Daniel just willingly says, listen, I don't want these things. I don't need these things. I'm going to speak the truth and say what I have to say. Now here is something significant when we get to verse 17. As he says, keep your gifts, keep your rewards, I don't care. But Daniel's saying, now nevertheless, let me tell you the interpretation, but I'm going to first present a little bit of my resume. Now in terms of Daniel presenting his resume, this is not about Daniel. It's important to note that as Daniel presents this. But he wants this king to know the history and say, listen, I want you to know why I've been summoned here and why somebody called me up to be before you. I've seen things. And it's not just because I have some magical power of the gods. So again, Daniel may be brought in as a bit of a sideshow, a bit of entertainment for the king, but now Daniel is recalling what he has seen. Nebuchadnezzar, his father, is one who could kill, could make alive, as we've already said, determines who's exalted, determines who's not exalted. Nebuchadnezzar set the tone of this. Nebuchadnezzar was hard-hearted, he was stubborn, he set himself above the Lord. And so Daniel's recalling for Belshazzar, saying, does this sound like anyone, Belshazzar? The difference is Nebuchadnezzar actually did something. You're riding his coattails, so you better be careful. So he's speaking as a prophet at this point. He's saying, you want to know what happened to Nebuchadnezzar? He rose up, he thought he was great, he was one who thought he was wonderful, and yet he's driven by the children of mankind. God gives him the mind of a beast. He wanders around, basically getting wet by the dew like the beasts that are out there, untamed like a wild donkey. Now again, this language of a wild donkey, this is not something that's very nice to say. This can echo even Genesis 16, where you think about the curse of Ishmael. It will be a wild donkey of a man. If you wonder, what does that mean? Well, I encourage you to either listen to a donkey or go out into the foothills and find a place where they have donkeys in a pasture and just listen to them. You can understand why a donkey has become an insult to humanity. They are not creatures you look at that's like a horse, where it has a sort of majestic way about it and the way it runs and carries itself. It's rather crude and crass in terms of how it carries itself and the braying sounds that it makes. So when Daniel's here before Belshazzar, to put it very cleanly, he's calling his dad a donkey. And he's saying this is what the Lord made him out to be. He showed him for who he really was. The Lord humbled him, and the Lord dealt with him. So he's saying, listen, Belshazzar, I've seen it with a man far superior to you, what the Lord has done. So listen to what I'm about to say. So as he goes, it's Belshazzar who has heard. It is Belshazzar who has been made known. Daniel's the one who now knows. And he knows what this means. So in terms of this kingdom and how Daniel is presenting it, he wants this man to understand the bigger picture of history. There is a sovereign God. As you drink from the vessels of his temple and you mock him, it's not about the temples, it's not about the vessels. It's about the God who rules over all. So let me now tell you what the reading means. Well, mene is basically mina. So this is a numbered weight. So it's measured in weight. Again, you think about the weight of silver, weight of gold, to get the actual value or currency of what's going on. Tekel is a weight of a shekel. Perez is the half minas. So as you find this declaration of what Daniel is saying, it's basically translated as basically mina would be weight of a mina. So 2 weights of a mina. Then you would have shekel, the weight of a shekel. And then you would have Perez, which would be half mina, or 2 minas, or 2 halves of a mina. So a mina, you cut it in half. That's where you get the last word that's going on here. So in terms of what this means, you have mina, which would mean the exact number, the exact currency. So this is saying your days are numbered. That's the writing on the wall. Daniel's saying your days are numbered. It's not years, it's days. Exactly what he said to Nebuchadnezzar. This statue is telling you, you've set up a great empire. It's gold, but it's going to be taken by inferior empires, as we find an inferior king succeeding Nebuchadnezzar in an ironic way. So now this king's days are numbered. Now in terms of the weight, this would be talking about God putting things into balances, like Job mentions in Job 31:6, where Job desires the Lord to weigh his good deeds versus his bad deeds. The Lord would put them in the weight, or he would weigh them out. And so this is what the Lord is saying. The Lord is now saying, I've weighed this king. I've weighed who he is. His days are numbered. In my weighing of this king, his kingdom will be divided. And so that's where you have the 2 half minas. That the mina at the beginning gets split and divided, and this king is not going to stand. Daniel then goes on and adds more to this. He says, your kingdom's going to be divided between the Medes and the Persians, and the reality is this man's going to die. So Daniel identifies which kingdoms will come in, and that this king is going to die. Well, now we have to marvel at what this king does. Daniel said, keep your rewards for yourself. He just told him you're going to lose the kingdom. But yet we find the hard-heartedness and the stubbornness of this man, that these men like Nebuchadnezzar, there's going to be an inferior empire that will take you out. I know how to change it. I'll just make a whole statue of gold. And that will usurp what the Lord's going to do. That didn't work so well. Daniel just said, do you remember what happened to your dad or your grandpa? Didn't end well for him. Now here again, this man in his cluelessness makes Daniel third in control, puts on the purple robe, addresses him as some sort of royalty, where he thinks that somehow he's going to usurp the will of God. But then the text tells us, that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede is the one who received the kingdom. So exactly what the Lord said. He's killed, and we have a Mede who comes to power. Now, in terms of the tradition that's handed down, basically Babylon falls without a fight. They basically go in. Belshazzar is executed even before Cyrus comes to the city. At least that's the tradition that's been passed down. Daniel doesn't go into all the details, and I'd argue he doesn't go into the details because he wants us to know how significant this man is before the living God. So in terms of what's going on in the text overall, you have this promise of this king celebrating the earthly accomplishments of man, that man can overpower the Lord. You know, we hear statements even today where we get so arrogant about medical breakthroughs, where people will say things like, I want to live long enough to live forever, where the theory is if I can just live long enough, they'll ultimately cure death. Well, the reality is God has determined man's days are numbered and man will die. We can't live long enough to overcome death. That's what's going on here. This king thinks he can overpower the living God, but the Lord shows that his kingdom will be established. There is no rival kingdom that's going to overpower him. We find Daniel, the one who again is cast away, not significant, sort of forgotten about, is the one who rises to the top, reminding us that the one who is humbled will ultimately be exalted, refreshing, rejuvenating, and assuring us of the very gospel story of Christ himself, that this king in the city of man will not prevail. So in terms then of where we began, if the Lord is sovereign over all, and the Lord is able to to be sovereign, how do we know that the Lord will ultimately put down the rebellion of man? What is the significance of this banquet? Is the Lord going to prevail? The irony is that in the midst of this banquet that celebrates the accomplishments of this kingdom, is unification of the world, its ability to overcome the common curse of God, is one that can't even read the writing on the wall, that's written in plain language as a decree from God himself, from heaven itself, that comes to bear. Now, in terms of what's going on in this, we find that the Lord shows that this kingdom will not stand. It's not about the vessels of gold. It's about, once again, celebrating the gods of this age. Where are the gods of this age to deliver these people? They're not there. It's only the true God who shows his mighty hand, literally, in making merely a decree, and it comes to pass. But the text is also desiring for us to know that this siege, or wasn't really much of a siege on Babylon, it's more just walking through the city gates, taking out the king and seizing the throne. It's not an arbitrary coincidence. God is working this by his providence, showing that Belshazzar is not protected by Bel, but is the Lord who determines who rises and who falls. It is the Lord who ultimately gives us the assurance that when his decrees are written, they come to pass. So this is very much assuring us that the words of God come to pass. When Christ is raised from the dead, it's showing us that the words of God come to pass. And so we do not trust in our word or our wisdom, but we trust in the Lord's word. This is why we go forward in the confidence of Christ, knowing that as we serve Christ and live for Christ, that is the essence and the joy of life. Living for the glory of God before his face, in his power, desiring to be conformed to his will and his ways. And it's the assurance that he truly is the shield and defender, as he promises, and no man can usurp his authority. Praise be to our God. Amen.
Thank you for watching or listening to our podcast. Belgrade URC is a Bible-believing Reformed confessional church that seeks to cultivate community around our Savior. If you desire to learn more about Christianity, please join us for worship each Sunday at 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. If you're not able to attend church, you can tune in to our Sunday live stream through our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our current sermon series and weekly meditation through iTunes or your favorite podcast catcher. If we are not listed on your favorite podcasting host, please let us know through our webpage, urcbelgrade.com. You can also utilize our archive sermon series on our website, urcbelgrade.com. Most of all, we hope to see you sojourning and fellowshipping with us each Sunday. Until we meet again, may the Lord's blessing and peace be upon you.